Here we go again.
No, not again.
You've been fooled.
How long have we been doing this?
Once more unto the again until we're both dead.
Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews with connections in mind. Thor Ragnarok is just hitting theaters, is directed by Taika Waititi, and of course stars Chris Hemsworth as Thor, Tom Hiddleston as Loki, as well as a host of other new characters, most notably Cate Blanchett as Hela, the goddess of death. And this time around we see Thor stripped of his hammer Mjolnir by Hela, who comes back to essentially take over Asgard, and Thor is banished to a world where he is forced into the Contest of Champions by Jeff Goldblum's the Grandmaster, and he is forced to fight Hulk on this planet, and the whole movie revolves around him getting back to Asgard and being able to stop Hela from causing Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. So first off, I'm just going to give a brief spoiler-free review of Thor Ragnarok before we get into some spoiler-filled analysis of where you've seen this film before. I would say, out of many, since this is a Marvel film, we've come to expect that nearly all the Marvel films are at least good, and it takes a certain extra punch to get them into great territory. But I think we can all agree that they're basically all watchable, and you can find a certain amount of enjoyment out of all of them. This is no different, and by far, this is the most enjoyable of the three solo Thor films that have come out so far. The first film, Thor, was perfectly acceptable. There wasn't necessarily anything bad about it, but it was really essentially just there to introduce the character in time for the Avengers. And the second film, Thor: The Dark World, also, it wasn't necessarily bad per se, but it was somewhat disappointing and underwhelming when it came to its essential conflict, its villain especially, and just the overall state. It just didn't feel like a very great Marvel film, but it was at least watchable, and certainly people who enjoyed the first film would find enough to enjoy in the second film. This third film, though, Thor Ragnarok, kicks up to another notch, especially since with the new director, Taika Waititi, he brings his own signature sense of essentially goofiness to the role, and he has said in interviews that he wanted to make Thor the central character of his movie, which was sort of a problem in the first two movies, but this is definitely the case. You definitely want to care about Thor in this film, and because this is also a Thor film in which he does not go to Earth, there's a very cosmic vibe to it, very similar to Guardians of the Galaxy's tone in that sense, and you can kind of feel that too, both with the cosmic sense of basically anything can happen, and the sort of craziness that happens with Guardians of the Galaxy is kind of transferred over to this film, and you get a lot. It makes it a very fun film. There's a lot of humor in this film. That's a great thing about this film, but it's also sort of, at least for me, it may not be for you, it's sort of a downfall to it where there are some serious moments to this film, and it kind of glosses it over in certain instances where it should theoretically be serious, but it kind of plays it as a joke. Or certain serious revelations happen and they just kind of get brushed aside by a joke. And I don't know, there were most of the time it worked, but there were a couple instances where I felt like it just didn't need to be that way. So, if anything, that's really the only main issue I have with this film. Other than that, Thor Ragnarok is a very fun film. Definitely go check this out. Now, at this point, I will say this video review will contain spoilers from this point on of Thor Ragnarok, as well as other films and TV shows. There will be a full list in the description below. If you have not seen Thor Ragnarok yet, and want to wait until you have, stop the video at this point and come back later. But with these things in mind, though, let's get into it. So there's a very obvious thing here with the fact that we've all seen it in trailers that Thor loses his hammer it's essentially destroyed by Hela, the goddess of death, and throughout the course of the film, Thor basically has to relearn that he has the power of thunder inside of him, and the weapon and his hammer was essentially just there to channel it, as told by a ghost image of Odin. And this is very reminiscent of Wrath of the Titans, the sequel to the 2010 Clash of the Titans remake, in which the Greek gods who were still left, mainly the two gods, Zeus and Hades. It revolves around them losing their trademark weapons, Zeus's thunderbolt, Hades' pitchfork, as well as Poseidon's trident. And by the end of the film, they have to fight essentially their father, Kronos, and Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, essentially says we had powers before we had weapons, and they essentially spend the rest of the movie using their powers as weapons instead of their signature weapons, the Thunderbolt and the Pitchfork there. So there's an interesting comparison as far as that, and it's especially relevant since both of these films feature mythological figures. Also, there's an interesting comparison. It's a bit of a stretch, I admit, but it's sort of a comparison here, in which, by the end, it is revealed that Thor essentially must cause Ragnarok in order to save the people of Asgard, because, as we learned, Asgard is a people, not a place. And unleashing a demon, Ragnarok is allowed to happen. Hela is defeated, but Asgard is essentially destroyed. Now, this is reminiscent of an episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, mainly Our Man Bashir, in which the Doctor Julian Bashir is in a holodeck playing essentially a ripoff of James Bond, and his fellow crewmates end up being caught in the holodeck simulation, and their lives are tied into the simulation itself. And in order to save their lives, Bashir essentially goes against type as he's playing the James Bond character, or his analog of it, and he essentially pushes the button that destroys the world. But in doing so, he buys the time necessary for the crew outside of the holodeck to save his crew. But for me, the most interesting and somewhat unexpected thing to happen in Thor Ragnarok is that I'm not entirely certain of this, but I feel like Taika Waititi may be a big Lord of the Rings fan, because there are way too many instances in Thor Ragnarok where you can tie it to a specific scene in Lord of the Rings. Not just the fact that Cate Blanchett and Karl Urban are both in this film and have both previously played characters in Lord of the Rings. Cate Blanchett played Galadriel the Elf, and Karl Urban played Eomer of Rohan. But also, there are several scenes in this film that evoke Lord of the Rings. Starting from the beginning, when Thor is suspended by the chain, and he's in Sarda's lair, and he gets free and starts fighting Sarda's minions. There's a certain scene in which, a certain point in the battle, where you see the minions crawling down head first from many columns in this chamber, and is very reminiscent of the Battle of Moria in Fellowship of the Ring. Not to mention the fact that the essentially character design of Sarda is very reminiscent of the Balrog itself, though that may just be a coincidence. But in the context, it seems more like a bit more of a coincidence in that regard. Also, there's a scene in which Heimdall is ferrying the people into a stronghold built by the Asgardians' ancestors in order to keep the people safe. But when Hela essentially discovers their location, he has to ferry them out through the mountain in order to get them out of harm's way. Very reminiscent of the two towers in which the people of Rohan has to escape to Helm's Deep, built by their ancestors. And when the Uruk-hai finally start breaching the walls of Helm's Deep, they have to flee deeper into the mountain passage in order to save the people. Also, side note, the design of the door of the stronghold sort of is very reminiscent of the door of Helm's Deep, not of Helm's Deep, of Moria from Fellowship of the Ring. But again, these are starting to stack up here. Two instances here. when Thor loses his hammer and is shattered, this sort of evokes two separate instances from Lord of the Rings. One from Fellowship of the Ring, in which the sword Narsil of Gondor is shattered by Sauron and is eventually reforged, of course. But there's an instance there of a powerful weapon evoking a people is shattered by an enemy. Also, in the extended cut of Return of the King, we see the Witch King essentially. He uses his powers to shatter Gandalf's staff at Minas Tirith, and he has to rely on his wizarding powers without his staff from then on, or rather not, because he doesn't actually use his wizarding powers after that. Also, a scene in which we see a group of Asgardians fleeing through a forest. And they're in hot pursuit by a bunch of Hela's undead Asgardian soldiers. This is and they're eventually saved by Heimdall. Killing off these soldiers is very reminiscent of the forest chase at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, when the hobbits are fleeing the Uruk-hai at the forest of near Amonhen, and they're rescued, or at least in the moment, by Boromir. And just the way the scene is shot in general, it's very low, and you kind of only see the people's feet in their capes as they're fleeing through the forest, and the undead soldiers are essentially grunting and heaving in very similar sound design to the Uruk-hai in that regard as well. Also, there's a very brief scene in which after the Bifrost is eventually emptied, the camera cuts outside of the Bifrost and pans down, and we see a cloaked figure, which we learn as Heimdall later, scaling the rock escarpment underneath the Bifrost in order to steal back the sword that controls it. And just the way the camera tilts down and we see it, it is very reminiscent, albeit brief, to the scene in Return of the King in which Pippin is climbing the tower of Minas Tirith in order to light the beacon of Minas Tirith. Finally, even though I've said all of these things, and of course, even though Cate Blanchett and Karl Urban are playing unique characters in this film not related to Lord of the Rings, it just can't be helped to notice that one scene in which Cate Blanchett's Hela is giving a speech about her background to a bunch of Asgardian soldiers, you can't help but feel sense certain elements of Cate Blanchettness leak through, which is the same sort of evil Cate Blanchettness that leaks out during her monologue from Fellowship of the Ring, in which Galadriel essentially lets loose her darker side and lashes out at Frodo when he tempts her with the ring. So it might not seem that way on first glance, but if you take all these things in context, then yeah, it does sort of sound like Galadriel in that instance. So there you have it. Those are the main points of comparison with Thor Ragnarok and films that have come before it. I hope you, if I missed anything, if you pointed anything out, or if you disagree with any of my conclusions, let me know in the comments below. Also, as I said before, my spoiler-free review, definitely go see this film if you haven't already, and it's definitely worth it. It is one of the better films of the MCU at this point. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate whatever audience I can get. Be sure to look for my review of Darkest Hour and Justice League coming out the month of November. I still haven't decided whether or not I'm going to do a review of Murder on the Orient Express or Disney's Coco, but if so, then November will be a fairly packed month. So thank you all for watching, and just remember, there's nothing new under the sun, and yes, you have to Thor.